So we're talking about storytelling today. A lot of fun. Storytelling in people analytics. Uh, I would just say as a topic, we were talking about this before, but this is one of the most critical topics in HR. In HR and talent in organizations in reality, you have so much data. We have so much data in HR. We have so much data in talent. We have so much data just circulating throughout our organization. And just presenting that data by itself, hey, here's headcount, here's attrition, here's whatever, is by itself not enough. And we need to tell a story around it, right? We need to actually present the data, help people understand the data so that they can action on the data and put meaningful practices and make decisions about that, about those data points. And so how do we actually tell that story is what we're going to work through today. And the questions we're going to ask and we're going to go through, it's going to be a lot of fun. So I'm going to intro our panelists. Before I do, I think the other factor I just want to make everyone and help everyone understand is this can be, hopefully you come out of this conversation with tangible skills. And this is really, really critical to getting, we like to call it buy-in, right? For HR data, buy-in for people analytics, buy-in for what you want to do within an organization and actually change within or within your organization. It's so critical to tell the appropriate story. And how do you do that? It's nuanced. It changes, it varies, and we're going to learn from two awesome leaders in people analytics, talent, HR space today. We have both of our panelists here today, and everyone on the call. Super excited! Everyone's here to join us. Let's start with an truly, I think, interesting example of when storytelling in people analytics actually did something for your organization. Doesn't have to be big, but did something, some nugget where it transformed the HR insights, how it was perceived within your organization. So we're going to start with Stephanie and would love to hear again, just an example, storytelling within your organization, some nugget.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question. I struggle to pick just one. I feel like storytelling is in every single analysis that I do. But I think back to a client that I worked with during the pandemic on the work from home, right? And so figuring out hybrid work, remote work, and hybrid and kind of the in-office strategy going forward. And so there was a lot of just, you could put a chart up and say, here's what people's preferences are. You could put a chart up and say, here's what people are doing. But that doesn't tell the story behind all of that. And so, how do you start to build a story where you're adding in demographics, you're adding in survey data, listening sessions, bringing in common analysis to then see the full picture of why people want to be in an office, why they don't want to be in an office? How do you start to paint that story for senior leadership to make a good decision about their hybrid work strategy? So we did that. We pulled in all the data. We looked at comments. We listened to stories. We pulled in a bunch of demographic cuts to see if there are certain generations or certain genders or ethnicities that prefer to be in an office that didn't. We pulled in survey data to look at preferences on why people and asking people why they wanted to be in an office or why they didn't. And then we packaged all that data up in like 3 slides of just like, here's what we did, here's what we found, and here's what we should do about it. And so having those actions and being able to say, here's kind of the story behind why people want to be in office. And we found that people want to be in office to socialize. They want to be in office to be around people after being cooped up in their houses during a pandemic. We found that most people preferred to be hybrid. Most people wanted to do both, where they wanted to be in an office, but they wanted the space to be able to stay at home sometimes if they wanted to as well. And the Gen Z actually preferred to be more in the office than older generations. And so we were able to start to build this story of like, here's the populations that prefer these different things and why. And based on what we found, our suggestion was then you need flexibility. Different people want different things for different reasons. And so having a strict policy was not something that we thought would be helpful. So at that point in time, we recommended to the organization to have a flexible work strategy. And that's what they ended up doing at that point in time. I will say they have now reversed it. But at that point in time, they ended up with a flexible work strategy. So it was cool to be able to use the data where we didn't just put a bunch of charts charts and numbers up there and say, here's the data, but start to build in the story of what was important, what mattered, and then also narratives. We gave stories of why people had needed the flexibility. There was a story of that we used of a team member that had a sick mom and was able to work while her mom was sick and be next to her side through a difficult time. And so sharing those stories put a whole different light on it for leadership, where it wasn't just looking at numbers, but you had stories behind those numbers as well.
That's really powerful. I think honestly, probably the first time I've heard this in HR, where you actually pulled out basically a persona of someone in HR and walked through, and that's so personal and so translatable to leadership that they have to feel and understand that. I mean, before we go on to Tim and understand his, a nugget of a story, what sort of prompted that? I mean, like, where did you pull from another industry in that, or did you like how did you come up with basically pulling out that narrative of that persona type of
Yeah.
story?
It's a good question. Honestly, I think it was our team just kind of reading the story and being touched by it ourselves. And so we're like, okay, this is a really good one that we should bring forward. The fact that we were all moved by the story, we thought it was important. And then we started pulling in a lot more. I mean, with these surveys and large companies, you get thousands and thousands of comments. And so finding those stories are hard to comb through, especially I mean, there's some tools that are really good, some that are not, but finding those stories was critical. So we pulled in a couple of other ones too, just to show the different kind of breadth of experiences with the work from home policies.
That's really meaningful. And I think, we'd love to understand, Tim, from your perspective, tell us, I mean, pick any part of your journey. Would love to understand like where something happened, where you changed with an insight, with a storytelling method.
Sure, Gabe. I mean, before I do that, I think the most important question though is why does yogurt like going to the museum? Because it's cultured. I mean, right? I couldn't resist. Okay.
If you have all the
Good.
attendees laughing, don't worry.
We have. I'm sure I do. We do love our yogurt here at Chobani and our coffee at La Colombe. So an example that pops up for me and one that storytelling really helped us to solve a business problem. And I think that's the end of the day. This is not people analytics data. This is actually business data that just happens to be in the people space. Something that Gabe loves to say, and I agree with it 100%, is that in today's world, dashboards are dead. And it really is about storytelling. And I'm going to give an example that I think really brings that to light, which is when we were at Peloton, we had the challenge of the CEO wanted to know why we could not keep up with the demand for Peloton bikes during the big onslaught that came about during COVID, and everyone was home and gyms were closed and people wanted to embrace their wellness still. And so we started to talk through it, but we realized that on their own, the dashboards that we were producing didn't get the job done. The analytics that we had in our applicant tracking system and our people systems didn't really do a good job in actually showing the true story of what was occurring. And so we had to actually lean into our team. And we had a team member named Andrew Delabar. I think he's here today. Hi, Andrew. Who actually, and because Equable didn't exist yet, took it upon himself to design and build a storytelling capability for us that instead of going and showing a CEO and executive team 10 different slides, we could distill it down to just 2 or 3 images that helped to tell the story of the problem, which was like, what is the capacity in the market? What's the available talent? What's our approach? And then a little bit future looking of with these pivots, this is when we can get this back on track, get the business to a place where people can order their bikes and have them delivered on time and installed on time, and begin to speak to the concerns in delivery that was impacting revenue because of the talent acquisition function. And I mentioned that example because we could have sent a slide deck forward of 10 slides and then speaking points, etc. But honestly, that's not what leaders wanted to see. What they wanted to have is a story and a conversation around what's actually happening. And if you think about the best TED Talks you ever sat in, the best TED Talks oftentimes don't have a single slide, maybe an image or 2 in the background, and it's actually the speaker telling a story. And so I think the future of people analytics, the future of how all of us will engage in our business leaders is going to be put a death to dashboards and put a focus instead on what is the business opportunity? How are we going to address it? What do we expect to see as a result? And that storytelling will evolve to a story that just adds more and more layers and chapters over time. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, great insights, awesome answer. I think the thing that I have to hone in on, because it's said over and over and over again, and I don't want to spend the whole time talking about whether HR is a cost center and all that stuff, but you have to notice the everyone attending needs to notice that you just nailed on something huge, that even though we call it people data, but it's business data, right? It's business data. It just happens to be within the people organization. That's massive. Like, that framework and thinking is totally different than I think what other people. So I guess just, along those lines, changing that narrative from saying, okay, this is actual business data, it starts with a question, right? It starts with like a business concept and business question of what you're going at. So take me through like a first step that you talked about a little bit. Okay, so the question came from leadership, but tell me, like, what's like, would love to hear like a first step that you would have taken or you took in that scenario to understand the actual business problems that were going on throughout the organization, less like reactive, more like proactive, if you have sort of an instance of that.
Sure. I mean, I'll lean back on that prior example, and Stephanie probably has even more examples than I have. But the one that hit us was actually having to think about what was the root cause of the problem. Like, why were we not able to staff up and sustain the quality and the delivery levels that we need to accomplish? And really, not just our own assumptions, but actually, no, let's go into the numbers and figure out what's actually occurring. And then I think to your point, Gabe, when we started to think through the solutioning, we took a pivot away from normal people data and said, let's stop thinking about the impact on people. Let's think about revenue. And I think, my president here at Chobani likes to make fun of me, but I tell him all the time, like, talent acquisition is actually a profit center, not a cost center when you do it right, because we enable the business to achieve its goals. And it's a mindset shift for all of us, right? But in our case, we went to, well, how much are we losing each quarter because of failed customer deliveries, delays in deliveries, turnaround time, et cetera? And so we use the revenue numbers and partner with our delivery teams, with our member support teams to actually model out what would be the profitability. And that helped us to tell a story that was different. It was a story not about give us money to hire more recruiters, to hire more people. It was we can fix $100 million problem with a $2 million solution. This is how we'll do it. This is how we'll track it. This is how we know we'll be successful. And so I think, Gabe, to your question, that was really the pivot, was thinking fundamentally about what's the root cause, and then how do we actually want to go about turning this around, and what would be the impact on the business in doing it right.
Yeah. Doing a root cause analysis is always super helpful. So appreciate that example. I actually want to pivot a bit, because we do have some questions from the audience, and I would love to actually dive into one of those, given that it's a pretty practical example. So this is coming your way, Stephanie. First, I would love to understand the following. How do you get access to different types of data? So we're talking, you mentioned employee listening and all the various surveys that you brought in. So how did you get access, practically speaking, considering it's from different departments in the organization? So the audience member wants to know, how it's often siloed in organizations. So how did you do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Partnerships and relationships, I think, are critical. Making sure that I always say the deposit. So you have deposits that you make in people, and then when you get ready to go, kind of get a withdrawal, they're willing to help. So make sure that you have relationships and those deposits along the way. So when you need the data, it's there. I also think it's important to have centralized people analytics systems, right? Like within your HR organizations. When you have centralized people analytics, then all of the data should be within one place where you're able to pull from. I think it's difficult when we have data separated all over the place in different parts of the organization, because then you do have to say, okay, let me go get this data from here and this data from there. But having those centralized organizations and centralized tools like one like Equitable, where it's all in one place, it makes it a lot easier to kind of pull all those results and pull them together.
Yeah, no, appreciate that answer. And I think, I don't know, Tim, do you have anything to add or any thoughts on that as well? Like, how'd you get all the data required throughout the organization?
Yeah, I mean, so I can tell you to Stephanie's point where it doesn't work. And where it doesn't work is where you have isolated approaches to data analytics. So my total rewards team has a platform that they use. I'm making this up hypothetically. My plant team has something else. My TA team has this. This other team has this, and then you're trying to cobble all these things together.
Yeah.
And so, when I joined Chobani, the key priority was to find a partner who could help us to look at our data holistically. And what we found in the storytelling was that sometimes the obvious root cause issue can't be found unless all of your data is actually talking and mingled and engaged. And what you find is actually turnover isn't the problem driving cost up. No, actually, there's an issue with attendance that you wouldn't have known unless your attendance data fed your turnover data, which then fed your insights into your employee populations, which then drove your strategy. And so if your stories aren't woven together, that's your first battle is how do I get these interconnected sources of information to harmonize and to talk on the same storybook and then move it forward. And so I think rather than spending energy on that, go in a different direction and find a platform that can help you integrate all into one discussion.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, I mean, understanding also that typically how an organization sets up their HR data, right? So you don't ask, we talk often in people analytics how we're involved way down the line when after a system is actually implemented. So you're implementing a new applicant tracking system, an HRIS, employee listening, whatever, and then you involve people analytics when, hey, I want to actually extract insights from the data. I think we often push to be involved in the actual implementation because how the data is structured and set up is super critical, because it's something as simple as just connecting employee ID or making sure employee ID exists within your survey platform, within your engagement platform, your performance platform, your HRIS, maybe even in your ATS. Having employee ID throughout each one of those systems is going to make connecting the data and knocking down those silos that much easier. So it's just also involving analytics leaders, people who know the data a lot earlier in the conversation. And guess what? You're going to get there and you're going to be involved in that conversation if you get better at storytelling. So continuing in that theme, so passing back to you, Stephanie, I would love to understand, accuracy is the biggest question. We always say, how often has someone come to you and said, this data is wrong? This dashboard's wrong, everything's wrong, I don't want to look at this. And how do you respond when someone tells you the data is wrong, the data is not accurate, and almost tosses out your entire dashboard or your entire analysis because it's one person off or something, maybe even more? But how do you toggle, how do you balance between accuracy and telling the story and making sure that everything sort of is in lockstep?
Yeah, it's a great question, and mistakes happen. I remember when I was working at Dell, I was getting some data together that was going to go to Michael Dell, and I made an error in the data and sent the email, and then like his admin was able to pull the email once I realized there was an error, and there was this big dramatic thing where it didn't get to him and all these things. And since then, the team has a rule of two pairs of eyes on everything. And so one of the things, like, just making sure that someone checks it, someone makes sure that it's right. Even the person that pulls it is not the person that checks it and sends it, just to make sure you've got two pairs of eyes on everything. But mistakes happen. Data, sometimes you're pulling from platforms that's inaccurate, so that it inaccurately pulls into the data, right? And so I think there's this, being giving yourself grace, realizing that mistakes will happen. There will be some errors in there, especially as new systems are created. At the same time, it's doing the due diligence to make sure you've got the systems in place to do checks. I don't believe there is a balance between accuracy and the narrative. I feel like those things don't compete. I think it's more so process. Make sure that your data is accurate. Make sure that you're doing the deep dive analytics, that you're doing the double checks in the numbers, then create the narrative. So it's more like a do this first, then this, then versus a balance. Do the deep dive, do the analytics, go into the kind of checks and processes that you have, then build the narrative on top of that, so that you know that your narrative was then built on grounded, sound information and data. And not everything will make it into the story. I think that's been a big thing that I've seen with a lot of my teams, is that we would do a bunch of analytics, comb through all the data, make sure everything was checked, and then the ending story was like 4 or 5 data points from the thousands that we had, right? And so it's like making sure that you've got the sound data, you've done the due diligence, you've done all of the analytics, but then it might just be where 4 or 5 things are what make up the actual story that people care about. And I love Tim's point about business analytics, and that being not being just people and talent, but it's being business metrics. Because a lot of times what we'll do is we'll go ask our people business partners, hey, like, what keeps your leaders up at night? What keeps your business leaders wondering what's going on the next day? And then from there, craft our story. And so it's like, okay, they say that managing out low performance is the top priority. So then making sure that the analytics and the stories that we build help answer that question for them. What can we give them from the data that's going to help drive that story? So I don't know if that answers your question. It's more like, yes, do the accuracy, that's key, but also make sure that that's done first before you build your story.
It's almost like I actually want to go down a different avenue now that you just triggered this, is that you might have, I mean, there are thousands of permutations that exist within the data for people data, but you might only want to surface 3. In fact, you should only surface 3 to 5, because people can only consume 3 to 5 or points. And even then, that might be too much. You might just want to say, hey, here's the one insight I found. This is what we should act, because the end goal being that you want to action on the data. So super powerful insight. Don't overload your end users. That's part of storytelling. Tim, I actually want to toss a question from the audience your way, and would love to understand basically how do we initiate a narrative when we have disjointed or insufficient data? So along the lines of the accuracy, the question we just asked, but basically what strategies your company use when looking at, or previous companies look at, when we have just not maybe the necessary data. We want to tell a story about promotions. We don't have promotion data, or we haven't yet coded people correctly, that we don't know what a promotion actually means, right? Something along those lines. Would love to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Whoever asked it, thank you. I might use that one for a future interview for people on this role. But the takeaway I have would be, firstly, never lie about the absence of data, right? It's easy in a leader's discussion, and they're like, well, what about X? Never guess. It's always best just say, I don't know, but let me go find out. But then to Gabe's point earlier about how much information you share, it's kind of like when you get called, or if you get called to testify, like answer just exactly the question. And so, bring the insights, but I think it's always good to also have the other set of the other set of data. When I worked at Amazon, we didn't actually do presentations, we did white papers. Still, by the way, storytelling, even more so storytelling, because you're focusing 100% on the substance. And while you only could present 2 or 3 pages, you had 60 pages of additional data in your back pocket ready to go. But you didn't start with that, you finished with that. I was employee, I think, number 10 at Amazon for the advertising business. Jeff Bezos had just agreed to put ads on Amazon and opened up and approved 185 heads on a Friday. And on Monday, I had to present the staffing plan to fill 185 people. And so that was a great weekend. But the takeaway from all of that was, okay, I don't have any studies, I don't have any data, I don't have the market insights, so I actually need to understand, like, what am I missing first? So I can acknowledge what data I need to get as I'm doing my first round of presentation and what I need to source. And then I can acknowledge what I do have that I feel highly confident about and I can lead off with. And so that case, part of it was actually building a sustainment strategy into my storytelling moving forward. So knowing what I'm missing, but being prepared and positioned to gather that so I can weave in additional elements to the story over time to provide the color and provide the insights that were maybe gaps in my availability to begin with, but become a critical part of the execution and moving forward. Look, anybody here can launch a project. Launching projects are easy. anybody here can celebrate a project being like launched off, but sustainment is actually the hard part. And so in storytelling, being able to tell a story where you're sustaining the conversation because you actually have data that shows how you're moving forward and through, and how you're ensuring that you're not going backwards is a difficult process. And so to your question, Gabe, and to the person who asked it, thank you. I think it's about being honest about what you have, being honest what you don't, building a strategy to collect what you don't, and finding the simplest way to present the information and have the access to the root data to help to support the Q&A process, but not leading with it.
I think very powerful. I think understanding when you present your data, what you said, present it as part of, do you present the data, but then you present, hey, we're missing this, and this is how we're going to capture this. And these are the partners we need in the organization to capture this. So I think that's really, really, really powerful part of the storytelling, because it says, hey, our work here is not done. And as we know, as people analytics professionals, your job literally is never done. Like there's always another analysis to do. There's always more data to get. There's always some process in HR that needs to be cleaned up. And people analytics has obviously that central role throughout it all in both visualizing, telling the story, and also cleaning the data. I mean, like we have to help the rest of the organization clean the data appropriately. So super meaningful and appreciate that. I think something I would love to understand a bit along the storytelling is, Stephanie, looking throughout your organization and throughout your experience and everything, I'm sure you've told stories. You mentioned sending something to Michael Dell, right? You mentioned, I'm assuming at United Health Group, you've sent presentations up the ladder as well, or even to managers throughout the organization or HR leaders. We know, I'm just going to say, right, we know HR leaders see data differently than other folks in the organization. C-suite see data differently. They probably look for 5 seconds versus looking for 2 minutes at data, right? Because time constraints and everything. So take us through, I guess, 2 or 3 different personas that you would tell a story differently to. Maybe one being, C-suite and one being HR. And how would you shape the narrative differently in your story building process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I feel like I'm avoiding answering all your questions directly because for this one, I'm also like, I don't really. So I learned this trick from an old manager where like she literally would go and like turn to her partner who was in the room next to her and say, "Hey, if you read this slide, can you understand it?" And it was like yes or no, and that was her check to see if she had done a good job with building a story that anyone could look at and understand. And I feel like if you get to a point where your story building is anyone can look at it and understand what you did, what you found, and what they need to go do about it, you've done a good job in building a story. And so a lot of the times my focus is like, can I turn around and say to anyone that has no idea what I'm doing, can they look at this and understand what I'm trying to tell them? What I do cater to is the action part. So while you might understand, hey, this is the data that I have and this is what I found, on the actions, I might need to change that and alter that of like, okay, from a people business partner perspective, it might be more of like, here's some things to do to support your leader. But from a manager perspective, it might be here's some things to support your team from what we found. And so recently I did an analysis where we were looking at just kind of overall some culture pieces within the organization, and we created several different versions of it. One version was something that went to all people leaders across the organization that was just like, hey, here's what we did these listening sessions across the organization, we found these things, these are the top things that team members told us about, here's 5 actions you can take as a leader and questions you can ask yourself to go help do that. And so that was one version that went to all managers. Another version was for senior leadership. Same thing. Here's what we found. Here's what we did. But here's the things that actions we can take as an organization to improve in these spaces. And so while the data and the story remains the same, it's those action pieces that I'll tailor to my audiences to make sure that they're getting at the insights that they really need to go drive and make a difference.
Gotcha. So you'll have multiple versions of that deck or PowerPoint or whatever the end visualization is, each with different action points for different leaders.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and looking over to you, Tim, when would love to understand similar question or same question rather. Given as a head of talent, you're you're definitely working with, engineering leaders and how to tell the story to them, but you're also working with C-suite. I would love to understand that difference and how you talk to an engineering leader, or really just technical leader in the organization. It doesn't have to be engineering particularly, but then versus telling that story to a C-suite like Jeff Bezos or whatever. And do you have different ways and different methods that you use for each?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to the level of detail that you expect the conversation. I think when you're meeting with an engineering leader, or really any leader who is a departmental or operationally focused leader, they want to hear tuned to their story, to their problem. Oftentimes, that's going to be a sample of the overall data versus when you're meeting with the CEO or the founder of a company. And generally, those leaders are more conversational in their engagement. Like they want to spend some time focused on the problem, but they want to spend a lot more time focused on discussing the solutions. And so I think, oftentimes when I'm taking that approach with a leader who's maybe a few steps down in the organization, I'll spend a lot more time on the problem because they're living in the problem on the day to day. When I go to a CEO, I might only spend 10% of the time on the problem because really the point of that conversation is what do you need from me to solve it? And so I try to sort of focus that part of the conversation less on what the issue is because they don't really care. Like they care, but they want to know how do we, like, what do you need? And I think you have to go into every CEO or founder or executive conversation with a mindset of what do you need from me as the CEO to help you? And if that's not part of your storytelling, if you don't have that as the next part of the conversation, there's a big aha, big takeaway moment that's kind of missing. And so, when we went to Jeff and said, we need a lot of money to hire a lot of people, but we think it's going to help the company eventually make billions of dollars in profit. Like it made the billions of dollars in profit, then I need a staffing team of 10 people and money to do this and relocation and all these kind of factors. A lot easier to business case when it was all said and done. But if you're not connecting your people analytics insights and storytelling to the business, then connecting that back to the resource ask or the awareness or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And you have to come into these conversations with like, what am I hoping to accomplish when I leave this room? And that's another part of storytelling is asking yourself, like, what is the story I want to tell? Because it can't just be a status update. CEOs don't want status updates. They want to know, okay, fine, now what? And if you're not ready with the now what, to Stephanie's point, find trusted peers and resources, find people in the business who are also in a similar analytical focus and get their perspective, test the storytelling, get it right.
Right. Don't just walk in and show a headcount dashboard and say, hey, look, our headcount is 200 people. You want to come in, and I like that. Start with the end goal in mind and craft the entire story to meet that. And we've talked about this repeatedly, but just making sure that you have that insight and you have that goal can probably unlock. You might go down. I would imagine you might go down that path, and you might be presenting your story, and then your CEO completely throws you off the track by asking a question, and then the entire derails. But hey, that's part of the process. Just understanding those questions and everything, capture those, write those down, say, hey, I don't know. Let me look at it again later. Let me get the right data. Let me build the process, whatever it be. So that's really great. I think I'd like to go to an audience question again, because I think this is super interesting. So we often see, usually we see this between finance and HR, but we see a disconnect between what the actual appropriate and right data is. And so I think that the question from Adrian Perez, apologies if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, but how do teams work with other data analytics teams to ensure the story you're telling is not different from what might be coming out of another data group in the organization? I personally saw this with finance and HR. I'm sure other people have seen this in other areas, but that's the classic one. So Stephanie, would love to understand a little bit from your perspective. How do you balance that? How do you get everyone on board together? Some practical sort of steps that we can take.
Yeah, it's a great question. Something I've loved about my new company has been this idea of communities of practice. And I've got a couple of folks on the call that have these, but I think it's been really cool to be able to get groups of people together and have, even if it's monthly or bi-weekly, these calls where people around the organization where we're all doing the same thing come together and we talk about what we're doing. I think the big thing is just communication, making sure that we're all aligned. And so we just started our kickoff of our community practice for employee listening. And so that's not just HR. Our comms team does a lot of listening. Our experience team does a lot of listening. There's all these different places in the business that are doing listening in different ways to our people to get feedback. And so we just added everybody to a call and say, hey, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we're doing. Let's talk about how we're doing things, best practices. And I think that's how we start to figure out, okay, let's do everything. How can we get it where we're all like, what's the source of truth that we all want to use? And so from the community of practice, we're actually kind of coming up with different committees. And they're like, okay, this committee is going to go focus on how we come up with toolkits for this or definitions for this. And I think it's similar for a lot of different spaces and places. It's going to be key to have these touch points, because you will go, like I've found this in one company where we were rounding differently. And so we're coming up in different numbers, but it's because we're using different rounding, like the 0.56 was something different for them versus us. And so it's like, okay, let's agree on how we're going to round. But you don't know those things unless you're talking to each other and having those regular touch points as things come up. So strong believer in kind of communities of practice and touch points to talk through some of those things. That way you don't end up in situations where it gets to the top and they got two different stories coming from two different directions.
I like that idea of communities of practice. I've seen it also with like a COE, a center of excellence around, people analytics or just data collection or employee listening, something along that focus. But getting together, communication is massive. So super meaningful there. Excuse me. I think Tim, I'd love to direct another a different Q&A question towards you. And this one should be super fun to answer, given all the talent teams that you've led over the years. But I'd love to understand what's changed in the past decade. Understanding that specifically from metrics that tie to leadership performance reviews, and then enabling, essentially leading that to like action. So like, what has anything changed in terms of like what we're even looking at? From 10 years ago to now, and then just how that leads to action with specific leadership. I would love to understand, please.
Yeah. I'm going to pretend I'm running for office, Gabe, and answer the first question that you didn't ask, and then I'll ask the next one. So I had to go back to Sevi's question because I just, in the back of my mind, the first thing I wanted to say was that spreadsheets are the devil. And it is the truth. And the reason why they're the devil is because they create so many version control issues inside of teams. I've got my spreadsheet. You've got your spreadsheet. We're using different fields, different tabs, to Steffi's point, different roundings, different date stamps. And, my first goal when I joined Chobani was to find the spreadsheets and try to kill them. And move instead to storytelling through centralized people analytics capabilities and analytics in general that's centralized. So because if you're using that, you're always referencing a specific date of when your data is from. And ultimately what happens is CEOs get frustrated because they hear this thing from finance that was a week older or newer than yours. This team hears it because of when you last pulled the date stamp. And the final piece of that first question is, don't use the data that's easy for you. Use the data that the business needs you, even if it means you have to be up all night. It's so easy to be like, well, as of a week ago, it was this. No, as of today, what is it? I don't care about a week ago, is how a CEO thinks. And then like, what's changed? What I've seen change significantly over the last 10 years is that nobody cares about the what anymore. And we get stuck in that space as people analytics practitioners, focusing on the what they actually care about is the why and the how. So why is this happening? And how do we make it better? How do we sustain it? How do we reinforce it? How do we get more of what we love about what's going well to continue to grow? But I think we all fall in love with our dashboards so much that we just spend every update focusing on the what. And that's really not what the evolution of business is moving towards. What leaders want to hear about is they know the what. They've seen the what. Many of them can actually access the same dashboard as you can. What they want to hear from people analytics leaders moving forward is they want you to go into the data and actually tell them what's really happening in their organizations. and not point to the dashboard, not point to the trend lines or the ANOVA distributions. What they want to know is what's actually happening. And specifically from the what, they want to evolve that to the why is it actually happening and what do we do about it? And so I think you have to move yourself away from just talking about the numbers to actually telling why it's actually happening, which means that you are in the data, you're in the weeds, you're crawling on the floor, figure out what's actually happening, and not just to the point that was mentioned earlier, pointing to something, but not really knowing what's actually occurring behind it. Because if you're in the business, you'll be able to sniff the data and tell for yourself if something's off. And then from that, knowing that something's off, know where to go to find the right information and actually tell the story the business needs to hear.
Yeah, I like I like that. One of the things that it triggered in my memory was when we were at WeWork, and I remember presenting. I just said the word statistical significance to our head of talent at the time, and it was like an extreme like explosion. It was like it did not land well, and it was like, what does it mean? What does that mean? Let's get into the numbers and all that stuff. And I think it definitely hit home where it's like, okay, maybe not the what, right? I was presenting like p-values and all that stuff, and it was like, no, maybe present the how and the why as opposed to the what. So that's really super meaningful there. I'd love to understand, Stephanie, if you've seen also any trends and insights change throughout, and anything that you sort of want to highlight difference between 10 years ago versus today. I'm picking 10. That's what the question said, but you can pick any time frame.
I was in kindergarten 10 years ago. What do you mean? No, no, it totally makes sense. I think the pandemic, I think it was Don from Microsoft who said the twin crises of 2020 really, really sparked this need for analytics. And I think it's the first time for people analytics specifically, it was the first time where I think everyone agreed that it was like unprecedented times and we had no idea what to do. You couldn't rely on intuition. You had to rely on what does the data tell us, because there was no other way you could make any decisions. And I think that shift, you saw this huge spike in just people analytics and conferences, and even like on LinkedIn, I was like, oh, people analytics is everywhere and jobs were opening everywhere, because it became this thing where like people were like, we need data to make decisions because we don't know where else to go and what else to do. And it was great at the time. And I think that over the last couple of years, it started to trickle down a little bit and not so much excitement. And so it's like, how do we keep the momentum and continue to show that we add so much value? I think there was a few years even before that with the performance ratings was the big thing, where people were getting rid of performance ratings, and everyone's like, okay, what do we do with performance ratings? And so there's this big push to figure out what's this new system of performance and what data do we have to now put people in buckets and manage performance and all these different things. So it's like things happen and we have these waves where it's like, we need data. And then it's like, okay, never mind, everything's normal. We don't need it anymore. Oh no, we need data. And then it goes away. And so it's like, how do we remain consistent throughout the years of like, hey, you always, you always need data. You should always be depending on feedback and information from your people and the data that you have to drive decisions for your people. So it's just been interesting to see the ebb and flow of the field over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm going to hit you with the 1-2 punch with another question because it's in line with that from Krishna. But let's say you have all these insights and everything that you mentioned, people insights and recommendations that we don't necessarily want to share with leadership yet, but you want eyes on it within the organization. Basically, like, how do you disseminate that information? How do you share it? And is there a world where I can tell a performance analysis story but not have it, blown up throughout the organization if I want to sort of like test and measure and then come back with feedback? I guess anything you've done along those lines.
Yeah, making sure I understand the question. So it's like you have data and insights, you want to be able to share it, but leadership hasn't seen it. So you're trying to figure out how to go about doing that.
And you don't want to share it with leadership yet. You want to keep it throughout the I guess lower parts of the organization or before it gets up to and bubbles up to leadership.
Got it. Okay. I get weary of those type of situations because my first thought is like, okay, why? Why do
Right.
you not want senior leadership knowing it? Is because it's going to be a bad news story. And I think that's where a lot of times people, analytics people, we get stuck because we're like, okay, we find something. We're like, okay, leadership is going to flip out. They're going to freak about this. How do we find a way to soften the blow, tell the story, what doesn't come on as hard, like come out as hard? And so I think we try and soften a lot of data sometimes, which in some cases I get it's less about softening, it's more about giving the context before the data goes. But in some cases, I feel like we get stuck in ourselves sometimes. We're trying to soften stories so that when it gets to senior leadership, it's more watered down. Sometimes they need the hard truth and the hard numbers, and they need to be able to see it. But in those cases where you're trying to build the context and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the story behind the data? I need to circulate this a little bit. I have trusted partners. I
Right.
always in every organization I've had trusted people I can go to where I know it's going to stay with them. They have approval to see some of the data. It's just like, hey, FYI, I've been working through this, wanted your advice. And so I think it's about networks, it's about relationships. Find those 2 or 3 people that you know that you can always kind of test things with, to make sure before it gets to senior leadership that their context is there, it makes sense and it's practical before you kind of escalate it up.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of goes back to where you mentioned before, either having those communities of practice that you can lean on, or
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned having given, you can now take a bit from some folks in the organization and have established that relationship. So we have about 8 minutes left, about 7 minutes left, and so we'd love to just rapid fire through a couple other of the community questions. And so back to you, Tim. Would love to understand if there are certain types of data that leadership prizes over others. For example, like anything like conversational, qualitative, anything along those lines that you've seen that hey, I need to look at. I think you mentioned like revenue based as well. Like that was a big one, but would love to understand if there's any additional.
Yeah, I mean, I think every leadership team's preferences around data is going to be pretty cultural. Here at Chobani, our CEO and founder Hamdi is super passionate about employee engagement, and he obviously cares about some of the other employee statistics and insights and data, but understanding how are employee satisfaction, how are they feeling about being part of the team, what things do they care about are important to them, and so things like doing regular surveys and pulses and getting insights probably surfaces higher than some of like the time to fill metrics and blah 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 that like we may talk about in the people function, but really depending upon the leader and what things are important to them, we'll probably pivot on the kinds of information that we share. And so I think qualitative metrics without quantitative doesn't always tell a good story. Qualitative metrics that lack the numbers to back it up means that you oftentimes aren't being perceived as credible because yeah, you're talking about the end counts, you're talking about the stories that are at the water cooler, but you're not actually presenting the insights that back it up. And so it actually does all come back to storytelling, which could be we have this few sets of data that are telling us that this is happening, that's driving turnover, that's driving retention, that's driving other issues. And then here are some samplings of comments from employees that sometimes, depending upon your culture, will resonate as loudly or even more loud. I think a good, wordogram where you kind of take the words coming in and make an image from that sort of tells the story of what people are saying, that then backs into some of the storytelling and the data that helps the organization make good decisions.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I think again, in the interest of rapid fire, we're going back to you, Stephanie. Do you have an example of an integration with where you used compensation to tell a whole an overall story, I guess, within employee listening and various different analyses? But we'd love to understand if there was an example where you integrated compensation data in and how.
Yeah, great question. Yes, there was. No, I cannot share what it was. But But yes, I think there are interesting stories you can tell, and a lot because my space is an employee listening. A lot about it is merging it in with employee listening data. So people that are paid, at market, above market, or beneath market, what's their engagement scores? Do they like the people that are paid getting higher bonuses? What are their engagement scores? So much of my work is tying into like sentiment and like, do we see differences in sentiment between people that are top talents and we know they're getting higher merit increases, right? And so just trying to look at how does pay impact engagement. And it's so interesting the things that you will find, and what you find most is like people want to learn and they want to grow. It's not always about money. I think our first thought is like, oh my gosh, okay, pay them more and they'll be fine. But so much of it, and we actually did this analysis at a previous organization I worked with where we looked at the highest drivers of people that were leaving during the great resignation time, and the number one reason was not comp. It wasn't any of these other things. It was the opportunity to grow. They just wanted to be able to grow and learn. And if you look at grow and learn, people always think that means promotion. But no, just invest in me. Show me that that you care. Give me some development opportunities. Give me a new role where I can learn a new skill. So just thinking of those things differently. And so I think comp, from at least in my world, when I deal a lot with just kind of the engagement pieces, it's more so just figuring out how much money is driving people, how much people are extrinsically versus intrinsically motivated tends to be a lot of what I do.
Yeah, no, and appreciate that. And I think that that's a great segue into we have wrapping up. We have a couple minutes left, but would love to. It's a great segue into our next webinar where we have some great compensation experts coming and talking about navigating pay transparency. So we have Sam Feldman, who was leading compensation at Grayscalable, and is now at a company leading people analytics, and we have Roxanne, who's at Cloudflare. And so super excited to introduce that. So please sign up. We'll send over the link. We'll send over a summary as well. I would really, really like to thank everyone for attending. I'd really, really like to thank our panelists. Super informative. Just a lot of insights that we gained. We're going to do a quick write-up on it. Not quick, but it needs to be more than quick because there's a lot of insights that we gathered from this that we're going to share out to the audience. But thank you, Tim. Thank you, Stephanie. Really appreciate you for coming and sharing your insights and your experience with everyone on the call. And thanks everyone for attending. We're just super excited to have you all here.